Some places are built on a single promise, a promise of jobs, of prosperity, of a future carved out of the wilderness, all of it resting on a resource buried deep in the earth. For over a century, the town of Norman Wells, in Canada's remote Northwest Territories, was one of those places. It owed its entire existence to oil. That black gold shaped its identity, its economy, and the lives of every single person who called it home. This was a town born from a geological fluke, a spot where oil literally seeped from the riverbanks. It grew into a vital artery for the Canadian North, a monument to human ingenuity against the unforgiving cold. It was a community that weathered global depressions, fueled a war effort, and adapted to some of the harshest conditions on Earth. For generations, the oil was the one constant, until it wasn't. For over 100 years, oil flowed out of Norman Wells. It survived world wars, recessions, and brutal Arctic winters. And then, on a cold January morning, it just ended. Not with a bang, but with a press release. Just like that, a century of Canadian energy history was over. The announcement from Imperial Oil was clinical and swift. On January 30th, 2026, the company stated that hydrocarbon production at Canada's oldest oil field would stop by the third quarter of the year, years ahead of schedule. The lifeblood of the town was being cut off. For the roughly 750 residents of this one industry community, it was a total shock. The story of Norman Wells is more than just closing an old oil field. It's the story of what happens when a town's entire reason for being is suddenly erased. It's about the fragile nature of progress, and it leaves us with a haunting question. What's left of a place when the dream that built it runs dry? To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what they built. The story of Norman Wells doesn't start in a boardroom. It starts with the land itself. For generations, the Satu Dane people knew this place along the Mackenzie River, the Decho, as Twegohua, which translates simply to where the oil is. They'd long used the sticky bitumen seeping from the riverbanks to waterproof their canoes, a natural resource woven into their way of life. The oil was just a part of the landscape, a well-known secret of the North. That secret started getting out around the turn of the 20th century. By 1918, a new company called Imperial Oil, now majority-owned by ExxonMobil, bought the claims. A year later, they sent a team of men, a drilling rig, and a single ox north from Edmonton to see what was under the permafrost. It was a brutal journey into an unforgiving wilderness. The men survived that first winter. The ox, however, ended up as their Christmas dinner. But their persistence paid off. On August 27, 1920, the drill bit hit pay dirt. A 70-foot gusher of crude oil erupted into the Arctic air, announcing the birth of the Canadian North's first oil field. Unlike most northern communities born from the fur trade, Norman Wells was different. It was the first town in the Northwest Territories created just for resource extraction. Fossil fuels were baked into its DNA. In the 1920s, a small refinery went up, and a town slowly took shape around it. This wasn't a settlement that grew organically. It was manufactured, a piece of industrial machinery dropped in the middle of the subarctic. It was, in every sense, a company town. For the first decade, production was small, just enough for local missions and mines. But global events were about to turn this sleepy outpost into a place of massive strategic importance. That event was World War II. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the U.S. military was terrified about its vulnerable Pacific supply lines and a potential Japanese attack on Alaska. They needed a secure inland source of oil to fuel the northern defense, and all eyes turned to Norman Wells. What came next was one of the most ambitious and controversial engineering projects of the war, the Canole Project. The plan was to build a 1,000-kilometer pipeline from Norman Wells, across the untouched Mackenzie Mountains, to a new refinery in Whitehorse, Yukon. Between 1942 and 1944, some 30,000 American soldiers and contractors swarmed the region, carving a road and pipeline through impossible terrain. The cost was astronomical, ballooning to over $133 million back then, the equivalent of billions in today's money. The pipeline was finished in February 1944, but by the time it was fully operational, the threat from Japan had faded. Cheaper sea routes were reestablished. After running for less than a year, the entire canal project was abandoned in 1945. A U.S. Senate committee, led by a then-senator named Harry Truman, later called the project a blot on the records of the military, a junkyard monument to military stupidity. But for Norman Wells, the project was transformative. It had massively expanded the field's infrastructure, proving large-scale production was possible. The war put Norman Wells on the map. The true golden age for the modern town, however, arrived in the 1980s. In 1982, Imperial Oil launched a huge expansion. The company built 6 large man-made islands in the middle of the Mackenzie River to serve as drilling platforms, tapping into the heart of the reservoir. A central processing facility was constructed. Hundreds of new wells were drilled, and most importantly, a new pipeline was built. This was the Norman Wells Pipeline, an 870-kilometer steel artery connecting the field to the continental grid in Alberta. This pipeline was the town's economic lifeline. Life in Norman Wells was defined by this one industry. The population stabilized around 700 to 800 people. It's an isolated place, accessible only by air for most of the year, with an ice road providing a fragile link to the south in winter. This forged a powerful sense of community. The work was hard and the winters were long, but the pay was good and the purpose was clear. Everyone was there for Imperial Oil. The company wasn't just an employer, it was the town's landlord and primary benefactor. For decades, this was the deal. Norman Wells was a small town with a big purpose, quietly humming along 145 kilometers south of the Arctic Circle. But in the world of finite resources, nothing lasts forever. And in a skyscraper in Calgary, the math was starting to change. The end didn't come out of nowhere, not really. There were whispers. And there was the geological truth that an oil field has a lifespan. After a century, the easy oil was gone. The natural pressure in the reservoir was fading. Production volumes, once the pride of the North, were in a slow, steady, and undeniable decline. By the early 2020s, the field's output had slowed to a trickle, making up a tiny fraction of Imperial Oil's massive portfolio. In the grand scheme of a multinational energy giant, Norman Wells had become a rounding error. A sentimental heirloom, maybe, but not a significant asset. The townspeople saw the writing on the wall. They knew the field would close eventually, but the official timeline always seemed comfortably far off. Talks with Imperial suggested operations would wind down toward the end of the decade. Everyone expected a slow, managed landing. Then came January 30th, 2026. There was no town hall meeting, no respectful visit from executives. For a community that gave a century of its life to Imperial Oil, the news came with the cold indifference of a press release. Mayor Frank Pope and the town council found out at the same time as everyone else. The corporate language was sterile and final. Imperial to wind down Norman Wells operations. The key sentence landed like a punch. Hydrocarbon production at Norman Wells will end in the third quarter of 2026. The third quarter of 2026, not 2029 or 2030, months away. The shock was immediate. Satu MLA Danny McNeely said he had to sit down when he heard the news. Surprise quickly morphed into deep anxiety. The closure, once a distant idea, was now breathing down their necks. As one official put it, the news came earlier than expected. Imperial Oil's reasoning was simple. Cheryl Gomez-Smith, the company's senior VP, cited the difficult decision made in the face of declining production. The company was also taking a $320 million after-tax charge against its earnings related to the closure. This wasn't just about geology. It was a financial move to wipe an aging asset off the books. From a boardroom in Calgary, it made perfect sense. The operation was no longer a big moneymaker. The logical move was to cut it loose, take the financial hit, and move on. But in Norman Wells, a town of 750 people on the edge of the Arctic Circle, it didn't feel logical. It felt like a betrayal. A century of shared history, of mutual dependence, was being ended like an accounting entry. The phrase, "nobody saw this coming," wasn't just about the closure, but its shocking speed. The gentle landing everyone hoped for had been replaced by a sudden, jarring halt. The engine had been shut off in midair, and the whole town was now in a free fall, wondering what, if anything, would catch them. The press release was just words on a screen. The reality of what they meant began to crash down on Norman Wells. First, the jobs. Imperial Oil was the town's biggest employer, with about 80 full-time employees and contractors. In a town of under 800 people, that's a staggering number. These were careers that supported entire families. John Lewison Sr., who worked for Imperial for 40 years, said the news just made him feel sad. But losing 80 direct jobs was just the start. The ripple effect is where the true scale of the disaster becomes clear. In Norman Wells, the town's entire ecosystem was built around Imperial's payroll. Local businesses, from the grocery store to small-scale contractors, depended almost entirely on the oil operation. The most devastating blow, though, was aimed right at the town's finances. Imperial Oil paid about $6 million in property taxes to Norman Wells each year. That wasn't a slice of the pie. It was nearly the whole thing. That $6 million made up a jaw-dropping 70% of the town's entire annual budget. Let that sink in. 70% gone. How does a town function after losing 3/4 of its revenue overnight? How do you pay to keep the lights on, maintain the roads, or run the fire department? Premier R.J. Simpson acknowledged the difficult news and promised support, but the scale of the shortfall was terrifying. And the dependencies didn't stop there. Imperial's facility didn't just process oil. It also generated the electricity that powered the entire town. On top of that, the company was the only wholesale fuel supplier for the whole region. In its announcement, Imperial gave assurances about a smooth transition of power generation and said there would be no near-term changes to the fuel supply. But for residents, vague phrases like smooth transition and near-term offered little comfort. What does near-term even mean? Who would take over power generation in one of Canada's most remote regions, and what would it cost? The community was facing a total system collapse. The social impact was just as deep. In a small town, economic ties are personal ties. Families who had lived in Norman Wells for generations, whose identities were wrapped up in the oil field, now had to think about leaving. In a social media post, the town of Norman Wells captured the collective shock, stating, "The news affects each of us in a deep way." The town wasn't just losing an employer. It was losing its partner, its provider, and its very reason for being. It was now staring into a long, dark tunnel with no guarantee of a light at the end. As the shock wore off, a chilling new reality set in, centered on the timeline. Production would end in the third quarter of 2026. But the next chapter? Imperial stated that final reclamation work, the massive cleanup of the century-old industrial site, wasn't expected to start until after 2030. This created a 4-year gap, a chasm, an economic limbo for Norman Wells. The main employer would be gone and the tax revenue would disappear, but the new economy of cleanup and remediation was still years away, waiting on environmental assessments and permits. How does a town of fewer than 800 people survive 4 years or more with no income? When it does begin, the reclamation will be a project of immense scale. Hundreds of wells need to be sealed. The 6 artificial islands must be decommissioned. The processing plant has to be dismantled. Decades of potential contamination must be addressed. An old cost estimate pegged the cleanup at around $180 million. But analysts now believe the true cost will run into the billions, taking 20 years or more. And in that staggering cost lies a glimmer of hope. A multi-billion-dollar cleanup could become the town's next economic engine, a transition from an extraction economy to a restoration economy. The same people who pulled oil from the ground have the skills needed to clean it up. One analyst described it as a potential $1 billion economic development project sitting right there on the steps of Norman Wells. It offers the chance for a new identity, one built not on exploiting the land, but on healing it. But hope is a hard thing to live on while waiting in a 4-year gap. For Norman Wells, the most concrete hope for survival has a name: the Mackenzie Valley Highway. For decades, this has been the region's biggest dream: a permanent, all-season gravel highway that would finally connect the isolated communities of the Mackenzie Valley to the south. The road would break the town's reliance on expensive air freight and the seasonal ice road, lowering the cost of living and opening the door to tourism and other industries. The project has been slowly inching forward and is currently under a lengthy environmental assessment. But full funding isn't in place, and a final decision isn't expected until 2027 or 2028 at the earliest. So the town is caught between two massive, slow-moving futures. The reclamation economy is a near certainty, but it's years away. The highway is a powerful dream, but it's still a complex uncertainty. The question is whether the community can bridge that gap. Can it hold on long enough for the cleanup jobs to appear, or will the 4-year chasm prove too wide to cross? The future of Norman Wells hangs in the balance, a town fighting to reimagine itself before it's too late. The story of Norman Wells is a powerful reminder of how fragile these resource towns can be. It's a story playing out in communities all over the world. Could what happened in Norman Wells happen where you live? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe these stories of change and community resilience are important, consider subscribing. The legacy of Norman Wells is written in oil. It's a legacy of innovation, survival, and fueling a nation's growth for over 100 years. But as the pumps fall silent, a new, more uncertain legacy begins. The town is a living example of a question communities everywhere are being forced to ask. What happens when the industry that gave you life decides you're no longer essential? Imperial Oil's decision wasn't malicious. It was the logical endpoint for a business built on a finite resource. The production declined, the numbers didn't make sense, and a choice was made. But a town is more than numbers on a spreadsheet. It's a network of families, a collection of memories, and a home. Today, Norman Wells stands at a precipice. Its story is a warning for other resource-dependent towns in an era defined by the global energy transition. Is the promise of a restoration economy a real future, or just a temporary epilogue to a finished story? As the world moves forward, how many other Norman Wells will there be, left to find their own way from a prosperous past to an unknown future? The quiet that is about to fall over Canada's oldest oil field echoes with these questions, a haunting reminder of the true human cost of energy.